When did you stop bailing out your sister and let her face the consequences? The call came at 2:17 a.m. on a Friday in late September, and I knew before answering it was Vanessa asking for money. My younger sister had a specific ringtone I'd assigned her years ago, a warning system that let me prepare for whatever crisis she'd manufactured this time. I answered with my eyes still closed, and she was already crying, her words tumbling out in a panicked rush about rent being due in 6 hours and her landlord threatening eviction. She needed $1,400 immediately, or she'd be homeless. I sat up in bed and asked why she hadn't paid rent when it was due 3 weeks ago. She said her car had needed repairs and she'd had to choose between transportation and housing. I asked about the $2,000 I'd given her 2 months ago specifically for rent. She went quiet for 3 seconds, then said that money had gone to other expenses and this was a different month's rent. I asked what other expenses. She said it didn't matter. What mattered was she needed help now or she'd lose her apartment. The familiar weight of her desperation pressed through the phone, the expectation that I'd fix this because I always fixed it. I'd been fixing Vanessa's problems for 12 years, since she was 18 and I was 23. I'd paid her rent 17 times. I'd covered her car payments, insurance, credit card bills, medical bills, and legal fees. I'd co-signed loans she'd defaulted on. I'd bailed her out of situations ranging from parking tickets to actual jail. My savings account that should have held $50,000 contained $3,700 because Vanessa had needed me. I asked her to hold on while I pulled up the spreadsheet I'd been keeping for the past 3 years. Before that, I'd tracked her debt to me in a notebook, but eventually, I digitized everything for accuracy. The spreadsheet showed dates, amounts, what each payment was allegedly for, and whether she'd ever paid me back. The running total was $47,320. $47,320 I'd given my sister over 12 years, with exactly $0 repaid, not counting the $6,800 in defaulted loans I'd co-signed that had destroyed my credit score, or the $3,200 in overdraft fees my bank had charged when Vanessa had talked me into giving her access to my checking account for emergencies, and she'd drained it repeatedly. The true cost was closer to $60,000, plus the interest I'd have earned if I'd invested that money instead of throwing it into the black hole of Vanessa's irresponsibility. I told her I couldn't help this time, and she started screaming. She called me selfish and heartless, said I was abandoning her when she needed me most, said real sisters helped each other. I asked when she'd helped me. Silence. Then she said I made more money than her, that I had a career and stability while she was struggling. I worked as a senior financial analyst at a mid-sized firm, making $78,000 annually. Comfortable but not wealthy, especially not after funding Vanessa's lifestyle. She worked sporadically as a waitress, claiming she couldn't find better jobs despite having a college degree I'd helped pay for. I told her the answer was no, and she shifted tactics. She apologized for yelling, said she was just scared and stressed. She promised this would be the last time she'd ever ask. She'd get her finances together, find a better job, pay me back everything she owed. She just needed this one final bailout to stabilize. I'd heard these exact words at least 9 times before. Every crisis was the last crisis until the next crisis appeared. I said no again, and she started sobbing harder, describing how her landlord was cruel and unreasonable, how she'd be on the street, how this would ruin her life. I asked why she hadn't called our parents. She said they'd refused to help her anymore after she'd borrowed $5,000 from them last year and spent it on a trip to Mexico with her boyfriend instead of paying the debt she'd claimed she needed it for. They'd cut her off completely and told her to figure out her own life. She said I was her only hope. I told her she should have thought about that before spending her rent money on whatever she'd actually spent it on. She called me a bitch and hung up. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding with guilt and anger. Guilt because Vanessa was my sister and helping family was supposed to be unconditional. Anger because she'd been using me as her personal ATM for over a decade and had never shown gratitude, remorse, or effort to change. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. The next morning, my phone showed 14 missed calls from Vanessa and a series of increasingly unhinged text messages. The first few were apologies. The middle ones were accusations that I was ruining her life out of jealousy because she was prettier and more fun than me. The final messages were threats that she'd tell our entire family I'd abandoned her in her time of need. I didn't respond. I went to work, sat through meetings about quarterly projections, and tried to focus on spreadsheets that actually mattered. My coworker and closest friend, Diana Hayes, noticed I was distracted and asked what was wrong. I told her about Vanessa's latest crisis and my refusal to bail her out. Diana had been listening to Vanessa's stories for 3 years and had repeatedly told me I needed to stop enabling her. She said I'd finally done the right thing and needed to hold firm. She warned that Vanessa would escalate before she'd accept responsibility. I said I knew. What I didn't know was how creative Vanessa's escalation would become. That afternoon, my mother called. Patricia Greenwood was 61 years old, a retired elementary school teacher who'd spent my entire childhood preaching about family loyalty and taking care of each other. She said Vanessa had called her crying about being evicted because I'd refused to help. She said I needed to reconsider because Vanessa had nowhere else to turn. I asked if Mom had forgotten that Vanessa had lied to them about the $5,000 they'd given her. She said that was different. That was between Vanessa and them, but this was about me stepping up as the older sister. I told Mom I'd given Vanessa $47,320 over 12 years with 0 repayment. There was a long pause. She said she hadn't realized it was that much. I said that was because Vanessa never told anyone the full extent of how much she took from me. I said I'd kept detailed records if she wanted to see them. Mom said that wasn't necessary, but maybe I could help just this one last time. I asked why Vanessa's crises were always my responsibility to solve. Why I had to sacrifice my financial stability so Vanessa could continue making terrible decisions without consequences. Mom said because that's what family did. I said no, what family did was support each other, not drain one person dry while giving nothing back. Mom got quiet, then said she was disappointed in my attitude. She hung up. 20 minutes later, my father called. Robert Greenwood was 64, a retired electrician who'd always been more practical than my mother. He said Mom had told him about the situation and he wanted to know the full story. I sent him my spreadsheet. He called back 10 minutes later and said he'd had no idea Vanessa had taken that much from me. He asked why I'd never said anything. I told him because every time I tried to talk about Vanessa's behavior, the family told me to be patient and supportive, that she was going through a hard time, that she'd figure things out eventually. He went silent. Then he said he understood why I'd refused to help this time and he supported my decision. But he warned me that Vanessa wouldn't take it well and I should prepare for her to cause problems. That warning proved accurate faster than I expected. Sunday morning, I woke up to find that Vanessa had posted on social media about how her cruel, selfish sister had abandoned her when she was about to become homeless. She'd written a long post describing her financial struggles, her landlord's threats, and her desperate plea to me that I'd coldly rejected. She'd painted herself as the victim of circumstances beyond her control, and me as a heartless monster who valued money more than family. The post had 63 comments, mostly from people I didn't know offering sympathy and condemning me. Several mutual friends and extended family members had commented expressing shock at my behavior. 3 cousins sent me private messages asking if the post was true and why I wouldn't help Vanessa. I screenshot the post and all the comments for my records, then wrote a response I didn't publish. Instead, I called Diana and asked her advice. She said responding publicly would only escalate the situation and give Vanessa more ammunition. She said I should privately message anyone who mattered to explain the context, then block Vanessa on social media. I followed her advice. I sent detailed messages to cousins and friends explaining the 12-year pattern, the $47,320 in unpaid debt, and Vanessa's history of manipulation. Most people responded with surprise and support. 2 people accused me of lying and making Vanessa look bad. I sent them the spreadsheet. They stopped responding. Monday evening, Vanessa showed up at my apartment. I lived in a 1-bedroom place in a decent neighborhood, 40 minutes from where she lived. She'd never visited without invitation before, but there she stood at my door at 7:43 p.m. with mascara running down her face and a suitcase at her feet. She said she'd been evicted that morning and had nowhere else to go. Could she stay with me just for a week or 2 until she figured things out? I asked if she'd actually been evicted or if this was another manipulation tactic. She showed me an eviction notice dated that morning, stating she'd been removed from the premises for failure to pay rent. It looked legitimate. I asked where her boyfriend was. She said they'd broken up 2 days ago when she'd asked him to help with rent and he'd refused. I asked about friends. She said none of them had space for her. I stood in my doorway looking at my 29-year-old sister who'd spent 12 years treating me like an ATM and was now expecting me to house her because she'd burned every other bridge. Diana's voice echoed in my head, warning that letting Vanessa move in would be the biggest mistake I could make. Vanessa would never leave, would take over my space, would create chaos in my carefully organized life. But she was my sister, and she was crying, and I couldn't quite bring myself to close the door in her face. I told her she could stay for 1 week maximum. She had to sleep on the couch, had to look for jobs and apartments every single day, had to follow my house rules. She agreed immediately, grabbed her suitcase, and moved inside before I could reconsider. The first 3 days were manageable. Vanessa was subdued and apologetic, thanking me repeatedly for helping her. She claimed to be applying for jobs online and looking at apartment listings. She cooked dinner twice as thanks for letting her stay. I started to think maybe this crisis would finally be the wake-up call she needed. Then Thursday arrived and the mask slipped. I came home from work at 6:15 p.m. to find Vanessa had invited 3 friends over. They were drinking wine I'd been saving for a special occasion, eating food from my fridge, and had taken over my living room. Vanessa introduced me casually, explaining I was letting her crash here for a bit. Her friends barely acknowledged me. I asked Vanessa to speak privately in my bedroom. She followed me reluctantly. I told her she'd violated our agreement by having people over without asking. She said it wasn't a big deal, just a few friends stopping by. I said this was my home and my rules, and if she couldn't respect them, she needed to leave. She started crying again, apologizing, saying she'd been lonely and just wanted some company. She promised it wouldn't happen again. Her friends left shortly after, taking the rest of my wine with them. I let it go because confrontation exhausted me, and I only had to survive 3 more days of this arrangement. But Friday morning, I discovered my credit card was missing from my wallet. I'd used it Thursday night to order dinner and had placed it back in my wallet on my dresser. Now it was gone. I checked my banking app and saw 3 charges from the previous evening after I'd gone to bed. $89 at a liquor store, $156 at a restaurant, $340 at a clothing boutique. all made at times when I'd been asleep and Vanessa had been alone in my apartment with access to my room. I confronted her immediately. She was still asleep on my couch at 7:30 a.m. I shook her awake and showed her the charges. She looked at the phone screen and said she'd borrowed my card because she needed a few things and would pay me back. I asked when she'd planned to mention she'd stolen from me. She said she hadn't stolen anything, she'd just borrowed it temporarily. I told her theft was theft regardless of what she called it. She sat up and her expression shifted from defensive to angry. She said I was overreacting, that sisters borrowed from each other all time, that I was being dramatic about a few $100s when I made good money. I told her she had 30 minutes to pack her things and leave my apartment. She said I couldn't kick her out, she had nowhere to go. I said that wasn't my problem anymore. She'd crossed a line by stealing from me and I was done. She started screaming that I was a terrible sister, that our parents would be ashamed of me, that I was abandoning her when she needed me most. I called a locksmith and scheduled them to come change my locks that afternoon. Then I went to work, leaving Vanessa crying on my couch. When I returned home at 5 p.m., she was gone. So was my laptop, my iPad, my expensive headphones, and $200 cash I'd kept in my desk drawer. I filed a police report immediately. The officer who took my statement was a woman in her 40s named Detective Janet Reeves. She listened to the situation and asked if I had proof Vanessa had taken these items. I showed her the credit card charges, explained she'd been staying with me and had access to everything, and mentioned this was part of a 12-year pattern of financial exploitation. Detective Reeves said that without direct evidence like security footage or witnesses, it would be difficult to prosecute, especially since Vanessa was family and had been living in my home with my permission. She suggested I could try to recover the items civilly through small claims court. She also warned that Vanessa might claim I'd given her permission to take things, or that they belonged to her. Family theft cases were complicated because of the relationships involved. I asked what I should do. She said change my locks, secure my accounts, and cut off all contact with Vanessa. She said people who stole from family members rarely changed their behavior without serious consequences. I took her advice. The locksmith changed my locks. I called my bank and credit card companies to report fraud. I changed passwords on every account. I blocked Vanessa's number and all her social media profiles. Then I sat in my violated apartment and cried for 20 minutes. Not because I missed my sister, but because I'd finally accepted that the sister I'd wanted to have never existed. Vanessa wasn't a good person going through hard times. She was a manipulative thief who'd been using me for 12 years and I'd let her because I'd wanted to believe family meant something. The next week was chaos. My mother called screaming about how I'd kicked Vanessa out on the street and filed a police report against her. She said I was tearing the family apart over material possessions. I asked if she'd be saying that if someone else had stolen from me. She said that was different because Vanessa was family. I asked when being family became an excuse for theft. She couldn't answer. My father called separately and said while he understood I was angry, maybe I could drop the police report to avoid causing Vanessa legal problems. I said Vanessa had caused her own legal problems by stealing from me. He said I wasn't wrong but asked if I really wanted my sister to have a criminal record. I said I wanted my sister to face consequences for her actions for once in her life. He sighed and said he respected my decision even if he didn't agree with it. Vanessa sent messages from new phone numbers I didn't recognize, alternating between apologizing and threatening me. She said she'd taken the items because she needed money and had planned to pawn them. She said if I didn't drop the police report, she'd tell everyone in our family terrible lies about me. I screenshot everything and forwarded it to Detective Reeves as evidence. Reeves said the messages helped establish intent, but warned me to stop engaging with Vanessa entirely. Block every new number, don't respond to any communication, document everything but don't interact. I followed her instructions. 2 weeks after kicking Vanessa out, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. A man identified himself as Trevor Atwood, a public defender representing Vanessa in an unrelated legal matter. He said Vanessa had been arrested 3 days ago for writing bad checks at multiple businesses around the city. She'd opened checking accounts using fake identification, written checks for merchandise and cash, then disappeared before the checks bounced. She'd done this at 7 different locations over the past month, defrauding businesses of approximately $8,400. She was being charged with multiple counts of check fraud and identity theft. The bail was set at $15,000, meaning she needed $1,500 to bond out through a bail bondsman. She'd listed me as her emergency contact and was begging him to call me for help. Trevor said he was obligated to pass along her message, but wanted to be transparent that he was advising Vanessa to take a plea deal that would involve jail time. Her criminal history showed 2 prior fraud-related convictions from when she was younger that I hadn't known about, making this a third strike situation. He said if she bonded out, she'd likely flee or commit more crimes. He believed jail was the appropriate consequence. I asked what would happen if no one bailed her out. He said she'd stay in county jail until her court date in 6 weeks, then likely be sentenced to 18 months in state prison if she took the plea deal, possibly more if she went to trial and lost. I thanked him for the information and hung up. I sat at my kitchen table for an hour processing this information. My sister was in jail and would go to prison unless I bailed her out. Every instinct I'd been raised with screamed that I should help her. She was family. I was supposed to protect her. But another voice, quieter but stronger, asked what helping her had accomplished in 12 years. It had enabled her to continue destructive patterns, to avoid consequences, to hurt more people. She'd stolen from me, from our parents, from businesses around the city. She'd committed fraud and identity theft. She'd spent 12 years taking and taking and taking without ever giving back or changing. Bailing her out now would just reset the cycle. She'd be released, promised to change, then create a new crisis in 3 months or 6 months or a year. The pattern would continue until I was financially destroyed or until something worse happened. Detective Reeves had said people who stole from family rarely changed without serious consequences. Trevor Atwood had said jail was the appropriate consequence. Maybe for once in her life, Vanessa needed to face the full weight of what she'd done. I didn't call the bail bondsman. I didn't visit her in jail. I didn't answer when she called collect from the detention center. I let her sit there and process that I wasn't coming to save her this time. My mother found out Vanessa was in jail 4 days later when Vanessa called her collect. Mom immediately called me hysterical, demanding to know why I hadn't told her and why I wasn't helping. I explained about the check fraud charges, the $8,400 she'd stolen from businesses, the 2 prior convictions I'd never known about. Mom said she didn't believe it, that Vanessa had made mistakes but wasn't a criminal. I told her to call Trevor Atwood and ask him directly. She hung up. She called back 3 hours later after speaking with the public defender. She was crying. She said she hadn't known Vanessa had previous convictions. She said she'd thought Vanessa was just irresponsible with money, not a thief. She said maybe jail would be good for her, give her time to think about her choices. Then she asked if I'd help bail her out anyway because she was scared Vanessa would be hurt in jail. I said no. Mom started crying harder and said she couldn't afford the $1,500 for bail, that Dad's medical expenses from his heart surgery last year had drained their savings. She said if I wouldn't help, Vanessa would stay locked up. I said that was Vanessa's consequence for committing crimes. Mom accused me of being cruel and hung up again. Dad called that evening. He said he'd spoken with Trevor Atwood and understood the situation. He said he agreed with my decision not to bail Vanessa out. He said he and Mom had enabled her for too long and it was time she learned actions had consequences. But he asked if I'd consider visiting her in jail to let her know she wasn't completely abandoned. I said I'd think about it. I didn't visit. I couldn't bring myself to sit across from Vanessa and hear more manipulation or watch her cry. Diana supported my decision. She said maintaining boundaries was crucial, and visiting would only give Vanessa an opportunity to emotionally manipulate me into helping. 3 weeks after her arrest, I received a letter from Vanessa. It was 8 pages long, handwritten on lined paper from a jail notepad. She started by apologizing for everything she'd done to me. She listed specific incidents spanning 12 years, acknowledging the money she'd taken, the trust she'd violated, the items she'd stolen from my apartment. She said being in jail had forced her to confront her behavior for the first time in her life. With nothing to distract her and no one to bail her out, she'd had to sit with what she'd become. She said she'd been diagnosed with a gambling addiction by the jail's mental health counselor. That's where all the money had gone over the years. She'd been betting online, going to casinos, playing poker with friends for high stakes. She'd been chasing losses and taking money from anyone who'd give it to her. She'd never told anyone because she was ashamed, and because keeping it secret meant people would keep giving her money. She said she understood if I never forgave her or spoke to her again. She said I'd been right to stop bailing her out. She said she hoped I could find peace and that she was sorry for 12 years of pain. The letter felt genuine, but I didn't know if I could trust it. Vanessa had manipulated me too many times. This could be another performance designed to make me feel guilty enough to help her. I put the letter in a drawer and didn't respond. Vanessa's court date arrived 6 weeks after her arrest. I didn't attend, but Trevor Atwood called me afterward with an update. Vanessa had taken a plea deal. She'd pled guilty to 4 counts of check fraud and 1 count of identity theft. The judge had sentenced her to 2 years in state prison with the possibility of parole after 18 months. She'd also been ordered to pay restitution to the businesses she'd defrauded. Trevor said Vanessa had handled the sentencing calmly, had addressed the judge with genuine remorse, and had asked to enter a residential treatment program for gambling addiction once she was released. He said she seemed different than when he'd first met her, more aware of her actions and their consequences. He said he'd represented hundreds of defendants and most didn't change, but occasionally someone used incarceration as a turning point. He thought Vanessa might be one of those people. I thanked him for the call and hung up. 2 years in prison. My sister would be incarcerated for 2 years because I'd refused to bail her out. Part of me felt guilty. Part of me felt relieved. The cycle was finally broken. She couldn't call me for money. She couldn't manipulate me. She couldn't create new crises that became my problem. She had to face consequences, real ones, for the first time in her adult life. Maybe that would change her. Maybe it wouldn't. Either way, it wasn't my responsibility anymore. Over the next 6 months, Vanessa wrote me monthly letters from prison. They weren't asking for anything, just updates on her daily life and her progress in therapy. She wrote about gambling addiction treatment, about confronting the reasons she'd developed the addiction in the first place, about learning accountability. She wrote about other inmates she'd met and their stories. She wrote about realizing how much damage she'd done to everyone who'd tried to help her. She never asked me to visit or send money or write back. She just wrote. I didn't respond, but I read every letter. By the 8th letter, something had shifted in her tone. She sounded clearer, more grounded. She wrote about getting her GED because her college degree was worthless without the character to back it up. She wrote about volunteering in the prison library and teaching other inmates to read. She wrote about planning for her release, about understanding she'd need structure and support and accountability. She wrote that she'd asked our parents to sign her up for a residential treatment program after her release, a 6-month intensive program for gambling addiction. They'd agreed. She wrote that she understood if I wanted nothing to do with her after her release and that she'd respect whatever boundaries I set. That letter I kept on my nightstand and read 3 times. Vanessa was released after serving 19 months. She went directly into the residential treatment program without contacting me. My mother called to tell me Vanessa had asked about me and whether I'd be willing to see her eventually. Mom said Vanessa understood if the answer was no. She said Vanessa seemed genuinely different, that the time in prison and the therapy had changed something fundamental. She said she knew I'd been hurt and had every right to maintain my boundaries, but she hoped I'd consider giving Vanessa a chance to prove she'd changed. I said I'd think about it. 3 months later, Vanessa completed the residential program. She moved into a sober living facility and got a job at a call center. She attended Gamblers Anonymous meetings daily. She still didn't contact me directly. My father mentioned in our weekly phone calls that she was doing well, that she was stable and employed and taking responsibility for her life. He said she'd been making small monthly payments on the restitution she owed to the businesses she'd defrauded. She'd also been saving money to eventually pay me back. He said he understood if I wasn't ready to reconnect but wanted me to know she was trying. 4 months after her release, I got a letter from her with a check for $500. The letter was brief. It said she knew $500 didn't come close to what she owed me, but it was a start. She was committed to paying me back $500 monthly until she'd repaid the full $47,320, which would take just under 8 years. She didn't expect me to forgive her or have a relationship with her. She just wanted to make amends for the harm she'd caused. She included her phone number if I ever wanted to talk. I deposited the check. It cleared. The next month, another check for $500 arrived with a shorter note saying she hoped I was doing well. Then another the following month, and another. 6 months of consistent payments, $3,000 total. No requests for anything in return. No manipulation, just accountability. I decided to call her. She answered on the second ring and said my name tentatively, asking if it was really me. I said yes. There was a long pause. Then she started crying and apologizing again, her words tumbling out about how sorry she was and how she understood if I hated her. I let her finish. Then I said I didn't hate her, but I also didn't trust her. I said if she wanted any kind of relationship with me, it would have to be rebuilt slowly with clear boundaries. She said she understood and would accept whatever I was willing to give. We talked for 20 minutes about surface things, her job, her therapy, her routine. It was awkward and uncomfortable, but not terrible. We agreed to talk again in a month. That phone call became a pattern. Once a month, we'd talk for 20 or 30 minutes. Never longer, never more frequently. Slowly, over the course of a year, the conversations became less stiff. She told me about her sponsor in Gamblers Anonymous, about the tools she'd learned for managing urges to gamble, about the shame she still carried. I told her about my life, my job, the trip I'd taken to Oregon. We didn't talk about the past much. It was too painful. But we were building something new, something smaller and more careful, but possibly more honest. 2 years after her release from prison, Vanessa invited me to her Gamblers Anonymous meeting where she was receiving her 2-year sobriety chip. I went. The meeting was in a community center basement with folding chairs and terrible coffee. 20 people sat in a circle sharing stories about gambling, about losing everything, about rebuilding. When it was Vanessa's turn, she spoke about hitting rock bottom, about the people she'd hurt, about her sister who'd loved her enough to let her face consequences instead of enabling her to destroy herself. She said I'd saved her life by refusing to bail her out. She said the worst day of her life was realizing no one was coming to rescue her. The best day was realizing she could rescue herself. She thanked me in front of everyone, her voice breaking, saying she didn't deserve my forgiveness but was grateful for the chance to try to earn it. After the meeting, we went to dinner at a quiet restaurant. We talked about our parents, about holidays coming up, about whether she'd be welcome at family gatherings. I said she would be. We talked about her job and her plans to go back to school for a certificate in addiction counseling. She wanted to help other people struggling with gambling addiction. She said her experience had given her perspective that could help others. I said I thought that was a good plan. Before we left, she handed me an envelope. Inside was a check for $5,000. She said she'd been saving extra money and wanted to make a larger payment toward her debt. She said she was on track to finish paying me back in 5 more years instead of 8. I took the check and said thank you. Then I did something I hadn't done in 4 years. I hugged my sister. The relationship we have now isn't what it was before. It's smaller and more cautious and built on firmer boundaries. Vanessa doesn't ask me for things. She doesn't create crises. She pays me $500 every month without fail. She sends me updates about her life but respects when I need space. We see each other for holidays and occasional dinners. I've met her sponsor and some friends from her GA meetings. She's building a life that doesn't depend on me or anyone else fixing her problems. My parents have cautiously reconnected with her too, impressed by her consistency. Dad says she calls him once a week just to talk, not to ask for anything. Mom says she's proud of the work Vanessa's done to change. 3 years after her release, Vanessa finished her certification program and got hired at an addiction treatment center as a peer counselor. She works with people struggling with gambling addiction, helping them navigate early recovery. She's good at it, according to her supervisor, who called me once to verify Vanessa's story about her past. I told him everything honestly. He said he'd hired her specifically because of her history. That lived experience made her credible to clients who didn't believe recovery was possible. 4 years after her release, Vanessa made her final $500 payment, completing the $47,320 she'd owed me. She included a letter thanking me for holding her accountable, for refusing to enable her, for loving her enough to let her fail so she could learn to succeed. She said those 2 years in prison had been the worst and best thing that ever happened to her. They'd broken her old patterns and forced her to build new ones. She said she'd always be grateful I'd found the strength to stop bailing her out. I stopped bailing out my sister the night she called asking for rent money, then stole from me, then got arrested for fraud. I stopped because 12 years of enabling had only made things worse. Because love sometimes means letting people face consequences. Because I couldn't save her until she decided to save herself. The decision nearly destroyed our relationship and broke my heart in ways that still ache. But it gave her the chance to become someone worth knowing. Someone honest and accountable and fighting every day to be better. We'll never get back what we lost, but we're building something new. Something real. And that's enough. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.